On live television, Ivanka Trump dismissed Jasmine Crockett with, "You should go to Africa to understand before you teach others about America." The studio froze until Jasmine leaned forward and asked, "Donald Trump is your father or your husband?" In just 14 seconds, the balance of power shifted. Evidence of Ivanka's corruption spilled into the open. The crowd gasped, the cameras froze. And here's the question: who really won that moment? Hold tight, what you're about to see could rewrite history before your eyes. The lights of Washington, D.C. burned hot on the stage, brighter than any courtroom spotlight. The nation was watching, millions of eyes fixed on a single table where two women sat face to face. On one side, Ivanka Trump, polished, unflinching, every gesture rehearsed. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, steady, fierce, carrying not just her own voice, but the weight of communities who rarely got a seat here. The host barely finished his polite opening when Ivanka leaned forward, her lips curling into a controlled smile. Her words fell as sharp as a blade. "You should go to Africa to understand before you teach others about America." Gasps shot through the audience. A Senate aide in the front row muttered, "Did she just say that Judge Whitmore invited as a legal analyst?" Froze mid-note, pen slipping from his hand. Even the host cards trembled between his fingers. The cameras locked on Jasmine. She didn't blink. No outburst, no flinch, just silence, heavy, electric, suffocating. Her eyes burned steady, as if weighing every breath Ivanka took. The studio air thickened. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Everyone knew something dangerous had just been unleashed. A wave of murmurs tore through the studio. It wasn't chatter. It was panic disguised as whispers. "Did she just say that?" gasped Representative Linda Sanchez from the guest section. Senator Booker buried his face in his hand. Even Judge Whitmore, famous for never flinching in hearings, shook his head, whispering, "Unprecedented." The host tried to steady his voice, but the microphone caught the tremor. He shuffled his cue cards so hard one slipped to the floor. He forced a grin at the cameras, but sweat dripped from his temple. Control had slipped through his fingers. Ivanka leaned back, folding her arms like a monarch surveying conquered land. Her smile curved sharp as glass. She looked untouchable, triumphant, savoring Jasmine's silence as if it were submission. But the silence wasn't surrendered. It was pressure-crushing, merciless. Jasmine's stillness was louder than any insult. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her eyes pinned Ivanka like a hawk circling prey. Every second ticked heavier. Reporters scribbled headlines. Ivanka's words crossed racial line on live TV. CNN's legal analyst mouthed, "Career ending." A cameraman swore later that his palms went numb holding the rig. The audience shifted nervously. A woman in the third row stood halfway, then sat down, too stunned to clap or boo. The air reeked of suspense. Ivanka's smirk faltered for the first time. Her fingers tapped the desk, desperate to break the unbearable quiet. She wanted Jasmine to speak, to lash out, to prove her point. But Jasmine stayed stone still, letting the silence cut deeper than any retort. It was no longer a pause. It was a weapon. And everyone knew the strike was coming. The silence shattered when Jasmine finally leaned toward the microphone. Her voice came low, deliberate, every word dripping like acid on glass. "Donald Trump. Is he your father or your husband?" The room detonated. Gasps burst like gunfire. A collective "oh" ricocheted off the studio walls. Representative Raskin dropped his notepad to the floor. A Supreme Court clerk in the gallery covered her mouth, whispering, "She didn't. Oh my God, she did." Ivanka froze. Her polished mask cracked. The smile she had worn like armor crumbled into a twitch. She shifted in her seat, blinking too fast, searching for composure that wasn't there. Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned back just enough to let the words hang heavy. Then she drove the blade deeper. "That question isn't just mine. It's been echoing in the minds of millions of Americans." Reporters typed furiously. Politico's headline draft read, "Crockett strikes nerve with Trump dynasty." CNN's legal analyst muttered into a hot mic, "This will be replayed for decades." The audience was split between shock and glee. Some roared with laughter, others gasped in horror. A woman in the fifth row shouted, "Answer!" Her security guards tensed hands on earpieces. Ivanka's fingers dug into the desk. She forced a brittle chuckle, but the sound rang false, hollow. Judge Whitmore shook his head, slowly remarking, "The balance has shifted." Jasmine's eyes never wavered. She had turned Ivanka's silence into evidence, her smirk into suspicion, and her father's shadow into a public wound. The stage no longer belonged to Ivanka. Every camera, every headline, every breath of that studio was Jasmine's. Ivanka's face stiffened. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tight smile that strained under the studio lights. She inhaled sharply, her voice returning with the tone of someone clinging to control. America does not need lectures from people who barely understand its foundation, she said, her eyes cutting toward Jasmine. This nation was built on family discipline and leaders who carry a legacy, not outsiders trying to rewrite history. The room stirred. Gasps slipped through the audience. Senator Warren frowned, shaking her head. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, murmuring, "That's dangerous ground." Ivanka pressed harder, her words like darts. Leadership is about respect, respect for tradition, respect for names that have carried weight for decades. Some of us were born into responsibility. Others are still learning how to act like they belong here. A low hiss came from the back rows. The cameras caught a woman clutching her pearls, muttering, "Did she just say that on air?" Still, Ivanka kept going, voice rising. "My father taught me that strength is inherited. It is not something you snatch from a headline or a protest sign. It runs in the blood." That line hit like a hammer. The audience jolted. Representative Jamie Raskin dropped his pen, whispering, "Did she just admit that strength in the blood?" The irony was deafening. Reporters went wild. CNN's Kyron blinked. Ivanka defends. Strength in the blood after Crockett's blow. Politico's live blog exploded. Ivanka doubles down, leans on dynasty. The silence afterward wasn't respect, it was recoil. Even the host stared, his mouth slightly open, unsure if he had just heard the implosion of Ivanka's credibility live on camera. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. The damage was self-inflicted, and every second that passed made Ivanka's words sound more hollow, more poisonous. The verdict hung in the air. Ivanka wasn't winning the room. She was burning it down around herself. The sting of Ivanka's last words still hung in the air. Strength runs in the blood. The audience was restless, the tension unbearable. Jasmine finally leaned forward, her hands steady, her gaze unflinching. Her voice was calm, but every syllable landed like steel on marble. "Let me make this clear. I was born in this country. I serve this country. I represent the very people who built it with their hands, not with inherited privilege. And no one, no family name, no dynasty, no father's shadow has the right to push me out of my own home." The studio fell silent. She didn't stop. She raised her chin, eyes cutting straight into Ivanka's. "I speak for workers who clock in before dawn and leave after dark. For single mothers balancing 2 jobs and still finding the time to vote. For veterans who bled for a flag that you parade like a fashion accessory." The audience stirred. Some clapped, others shouted, "That's right." Senator Cory Booker leaned over his mic. "She's speaking the truth of millions." Jasmine pressed harder, her voice now sharp with defiance. "You say leadership is inherited. No. Leadership is earned in the trenches of real life, in neighborhoods where broken promises echo louder than campaign slogans. I stand here because America put me here, not because of a last name carved into a building." Reporters scribbled furiously. MSNBC's live blog updated in real time. Crockett hammers Ivanka, "No one pushes me out of my own home." CNN legal analyst Laura Coates muttered into the panel mic, "That's history. She's rewriting the power dynamic live." Ivanka's composure cracked further, her jaw tightened, eyes narrowing, but she couldn't interrupt. The tide had turned. Jasmine leaned even closer, her tone cutting with surgical precision. "So hear me now. This table, this stage, this country, it belongs to all of us. Not because of bloodlines, not because of dynasties, but because we are Americans. And I refuse to be treated as a guest in my own nation." The words struck like thunder. The audience erupted, half on their feet, clapping, shouting, cheering. The host glanced at his notes, realizing they were useless now. The duel wasn't just political anymore. It was personal, it was moral, and Jasmine had just planted her flag. The final echo of Jasmine's words, "I refuse to be treated as a guest in my own nation," still vibrated in the air when the audience surged to their feet. The applause hit like a wave crashing against the stage. Palms clapped, raw cheers thundered, and the sound swallowed every attempt at order. Senator Booker rose, clapping above his head, mouthing, "That's leadership." Representative Linda Sanchez shouted from the guest row, "Say it louder for the people in the back." Even Judge Whitmore, usually stone-faced, pushed his chair back and nodded slowly, murmuring, "That's the Constitution in flesh and blood." Ivanka's face twitched. She forced a nod, lips tightening into what looked like acknowledgement, but felt like surrender. Her hands gripped the desk, knuckles whitening. She tilted her chin in a weak attempt at composure, but the cameras caught the flicker of panic behind her eyes. The host tried to cut through the roar. "Ladies, please, let's bring it back." His words drowned instantly. The crowd wouldn't sit. Producers waved frantically from behind the cameras, gesturing for calm, but their signals were useless. The audience was alive, electricity coursing through every row. One veteran in uniform stood tall and saluted Jasmine. A mother in the third row lifted her child onto her shoulders, shouting, "This is our America too." Reporters hammered keyboards, tweets firing off in real time. Studio explodes after Crockett's speech. Ivanka cornered nods in silence. Host loses control, unprecedented moment on live TV. Jasmine remained seated, her hands folded calmly, watching the storm she had unleashed. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. The stillness of her posture only magnified the force of her words, as if she had already moved on to the next battle. Ivanka leaned slightly toward the host, whispering, "Get this under control." But there was nothing left to control. The duel had broken past the stage. It had spilled into the veins of everyone watching in the studio at home across the country. The question was no longer whether Jasmine had won the exchange. It was what Ivanka would dare to say next if she said anything at all. The roar inside the studio hadn't even quieted when the outside world caught fire. Reporters rushed from their seats the moment the cameras cut to commercial phones, raised fingers flying. Within minutes, every outlet had a headline stamped across their front pages. CNN's breaking banner screamed, "Crockett drops bomb on Ivanka Trump." The Washington Post went live with Who Really Belongs, Crockett versus Trump Dynasty. Politico blasted a push notification, "Unprecedented Clash Rocks primetime hearing." But it was Twitter that turned the studio earthquake into a national shockwave. The hashtag #WhoIsIvanka shot to #1 in less than 15 minutes. Tweets poured in by the thousands. Jasmine just asked the question America's been whispering for years. Bloodline isn't leadership. Jasmine Crockett proved it tonight. Who is Ivanka, a daughter, an advisor, or something darker? Screens lit up in living rooms, bars, and airports. The clip of Jasmine leaning forward and delivering her razor line spread faster than producers could issue takedown requests. NBC's Hallie Jackson stood outside the building reporting live as the crowd gathered. "I've covered dozens of hearings," she told viewers, "but I've never seen a moment spiral into this kind of cultural flashpoint." Behind her, protesters waved hastily printed signs, "Respect is earned, and this is our America." Even lawmakers joined the digital melee. Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeted, "Strength is service, not inheritance." Jasmine Crockett said what millions feel. Meanwhile, Senator Ted Cruz fired back, calling Jasmine's words disgraceful and beneath Congress. The divide was immediate, explosive, and impossible to contain. Back inside, producers whispered nervously into headsets, warning the host that the control room was being drowned out by the noise online. Judge Whitmore, leaving the studio floor, told a reporter from NPR, "Mark my words, this night will be studied in law schools as an example of when silence and one question can redraw power." The battle wasn't just on a stage anymore. It had become a national referendum, one hashtag at a time. The storm online had barely settled when Jasmine leaned forward again, this time with papers in hand. The noise of the crowd hushed. The cameras zoomed closer. Her tone was calm but sharp, each word cutting through the tension. "It's easy to talk about tradition and legacy," she began, "but the American people deserve to see what that legacy really means when power is abused." She held up a folder marked with the seal of the Department of Justice. Murmurs rippled instantly across the gallery. Senator Collins, sitting in the second row, as an observer, shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew something heavy was about to drop. Jasmine continued, "Here is correspondence verified by DOJ investigator Robert Hensley showing Ivanka Trump directly contacted federal officials to steer a real estate development project in Virginia Beach. Not for the people, not for the community, but to secure financial interests tied directly to her family. The room exploded. Gasps collided with shouts. The host stammered, "Congresswoman, are you certain?" But his voice drowned beneath the audience's roar. Reporters typed furiously. NBC flashed a headline within minutes. Crockett drops DOJ, evidence against Ivanka. A CBS analyst muttered on air, "This crosses into criminal territory." Ivanka tried to wave it off, shaking her head, forcing a laugh. "This is nonsense, baseless," she started, but Jasmine didn't give her the chance. Baseless Jasmine snapped her voice, cutting across the studio. "Then explain why these documents show your name on an email thread with senior housing officials demanding approvals within 48 hours. Explain why Senator Collins, who lobbied on your behalf, is listed in the same chain." The audience erupted again. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering to a CNN reporter, "This is no longer theater. This is evidence." Ivanka's polished mask faltered. She pressed her lips tight, her eyes darting to the host, then to the cameras, then back to Jasmine, but there was nowhere to run. Jasmine lowered the folder onto the desk with deliberate force. This is what happens when power is inherited instead of earned. Communities lose, families are displaced, and the American people are robbed of fairness. The cameras caught every detail: Ivanka's trembling hand, the audience on its feet, and Jasmine's unwavering gaze. The fight had shifted. This was no longer a war of words. It was a battle of receipts. The folder lay open on the desk, pages fanned like blades. The audience was on fire, voices clashing, some chanting, "Answer." While others demanded resign, Ivanka sat rigid, jaw tight. This time she didn't laugh or wave it off. She leaned toward the microphone, voice sharpened like glass. "Let's be clear. These so-called emails are being twisted. Yes, I corresponded with federal officials, but every communication was public record, logged and cleared by Ethics Council. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was secret." A ripple cut through the room. The volume dipped, not silence, but hesitation. She pressed the point, her hand slamming the desk. Once Senator Collins advocated for that project because it created jobs in Virginia. Thousands of jobs. The Department of Justice investigator you name, Robert Hensley. He already testified those emails showed no criminal violation. Facts matter. Reporters scrambled, searching archives. On the MSNBC Live blog, a headline updated: Ivanka strikes back, CITES ethics clearance. Judge Whitmore, arms crossed, whispered to NPR's Mike, "She's framing it as procedure, not privilege." The host leaned in nervously. Congresswoman Crockett response. But Jasmine didn't move yet. She let Ivanka fill the air, fill the silence, and fill the cracks. Ivanka seized the moment, her eyes sweeping the audience. "This isn't evidence of corruption. It's evidence of service. You may not like my name, but you cannot erase the projects, the jobs, the growth my efforts have delivered. You call it influence. I call it results." The crowd split, boos clashing with claps, outrage battling approval. The tension was alive, pulsing, dangerous. For the first time all night, Ivanka looked less like prey and more like a fighter ready to bite back. The clash over federal projects still buzzed in the air. Ivanka had just finished defending herself with talk of jobs and results. Her words still hanging when Jasmine calmly reached for another folder. She didn't rush. She opened it with precision, sliding a page into the light. Her voice dropped to a deliberate cadence. "Since we're speaking of legacy, of names and families, let's talk about what that legacy really looks like in public." The audience leaned forward, instinctively bracing. Reporters raised their pens. Jasmine lifted the sheet. "Here is a direct quote from Donald Trump, 2006, on a daytime talk show. He said, and I quote, 'If Ivanka weren't my daughter, perhaps I'd be dating her.'" The room detonated. Gasps echoed like thunderclaps. A woman in the second row put her hand over her child's ears. Senator Gillibrand slammed her palm against the table, whispering, "Unbelievable." Ivanka froze. Color drained from her face. Her lips parted, but no words came. Jasmine wasn't done. She read another line, this time from a magazine interview. "He said she has the best body. He said she's a piece of you-know-what." These are his words, not mine. This is the image of respect you claim to inherit. The host's jaw dropped. He looked to the producers off stage, but no one dared to cut the feed. Reporters were typing so fast their laptops rattled. MSNBC's breaking banner rolled: Crockett reads, Trump's controversial remarks about Ivanka on air. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his voice low but clear enough for microphones. This is a public record. She's using his own words. The audience erupted again. Not laughter this time, but a heavy mix of disgust and shock. Some booed. Others shouted, "Answer." Her Jasmine folded the page carefully, her eyes never leaving Ivanka. Her tone was sharp, not cruel, but cutting enough to strip away every layer of polish. So when you stand here and preach about bloodlines and inherited strength, understand this: you're asking America to accept that kind of legacy as leadership. Ivanka swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the cameras. For once, she looked cornered, not by politics, but by her own father's words resurrected under the brightest lights in the country. And the nation watching knew this was no longer about policy. This was about the shadows that never leave a name. The chamber was frozen in shock. Jasmine's words had cut too deep, too public, too raw. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some burying their faces in their hands, others leaning forward as if unable to look away. The line about a father speaking of his daughter in that way was not just controversial, it was a taboo dragged into the harshest light. Producers panicked. In the control booth, signals crossed decisions made in seconds. The live feed vanished from television screens across America, replaced with the bland red banner, "We'll be right back." But the silence in living rooms spoke louder than any anchor. Something had happened, something the networks didn't want the public to hear. It was too late. The clip was already everywhere. Audience members had filmed it on their phones. Within minutes, the video raced across Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. What had been cut from broadcast had become impossible to contain. Hashtags ignited like fire, Trump words, Crockett strikes, Ivanka clip. The footage spread at a speed even the networks couldn't match. Every second replayed Jasmine leaning forward, the paper in her hand, the stunned face of Ivanka caught in perfect clarity. News outlets scrambled. Anchors on rival channels filled the gaps, describing the moment in rushed tones. Online reporters live-blogged every update. Articles poured out, the hearing that shook the dynasty. Crockett reads Trump's words aloud. Ivanka stunned as father's remarks go viral. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere turned suffocating. People knew the broadcast had been cut, but everyone's phones kept buzzing. Screens lit up with the same video again and again. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, looking pale as if he understood the weight of what had just been unleashed. Senators whispered to each other, their faces tight with disbelief. Ivanka sat, stiff eyes darting her posture, betraying the loss of control. She had no way to stop what was spreading. No statement could erase the image now burned into the public's mind. By the time the feed returned, the damage was irreversible. Millions had already seen it. Millions more were sharing it. The attempt to censor had only made the story louder, sharper, and impossible to bury. This was no longer about a single hearing. It had become a cultural reckoning, and the flood had only just begun. The broadcast had returned, but the damage was irreversible. The viral clip looped endlessly online, and every buzz of a phone in the chamber reminded Ivanka of it. She sat rigid, staring straight ahead, but her skin betrayed her. A flush crept up her neck, blooming across her face. The audience could see it. Senators could see it. Even the camera zooming tight captured the moment her mask fractured. Her hand trembled as she reached for her glass of water. The microphone picked up the faint clink against the desk. When she tried to speak, her voice snagged, the practiced smoothness gone. She attempted to push forward to pretend the scandal hadn't pierced the walls. Words about service and responsibility stumbled from her mouth, but they fell flat. The cadence was broken, the authority missing. In the gallery, Judge Whitmore leaned to a reporter and muttered, "She's unraveling." Senator Gillibrand shook her head, whispering, "She's lost the room." The silence after each phrase was more damning than any rebuttal Jasmine could have offered. The audience was no longer listening to Ivanka. They were watching her falter breath by breath. Jasmine stayed still, her eyes steady, her presence a mirror reflecting Ivanka's collapse back to the nation. She didn't need to add a word. The contrast was enough. One woman composed the other, visibly cracking under the weight of her father's shadow. By the time Ivanka finished her halting remarks, the applause she expected never came. Only scattered coughs and the clicking of reporters' keyboards filled the room. Control had slipped away, and everyone knew Jasmine had not just won the exchange, she had broken the illusion of invulnerability surrounding Ivanka Trump. The chamber hadn't recovered from Ivanka's collapse when the committee chair struck the gavel 3 times. The sound cut through the air, heavy as thunder. All eyes shifted to the side of the room, where a tall, gray-haired figure stood with a folder tucked under his arm. Director Harris of the Government Accountability Office, a man known in Washington for his bluntness and refusal to bend under political weight. His presence alone drained the last trace of poise from Ivanka's face. He spoke with the calm of someone carrying dynamite. The committee has received the findings of an independent investigation into federal appropriations tied to Ms. Trump's activities. These findings are no longer allegations. They are verified. The room tensed. Reporters hunched over laptops. Jasmine leaned forward, hands folded, eyes locked on Harris. He opened the folder. Between 2018 and 2020, federal housing funds were redirected toward private development projects involving the Trump Organization. The paper trail confirms that Ms. Ivanka Trump exercised influence through direct communication with mid-level federal officials. She leveraged her position to expedite approvals and divert millions intended for public housing to luxury real estate. The words sliced through the chamber. Gasps erupted. Senator Warren closed her eyes, whispering, "There it is." Harris didn't pause. Emails, contracts, and transfer receipts are included in the record. The office has confirmed signatures, dates, and authorization logs. This is not conjecture. This is misuse of public money. The host's hand shook as he adjusted his microphone. The audience murmured some shouting in disbelief, others clapping in anger. Judge Whitmore leaned back and muttered, "That's fraud, plain and simple." Ivanka's blush turned pale. She shook her head, trying to interject, but Harris continued. Taxpayer dollars meant for working families were siphoned into developments where average rent exceeds $5,000 a month. In plain terms, money for the poor was funneled into projects for the rich. Ms. Trump's fingerprints are all over the scheme. The chamber boiled. Reporters shouted over one another. Headlines exploded online. GAO report, Ivanka misused federal funds. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence now carried the weight of victory. The evidence was not hers to present, it came from the government's own watchdog. Harris closed the folder, his voice unwavering. This committee must now decide the next step. But the facts are here, and the facts are damning. The audience rose, some in applause, others in outrage. The host had lost the room entirely. Ivanka stared ahead, blinking fast, her control stripped by black and white records no spin could erase. The duel had crossed into a new battlefield, one where opinion no longer mattered. Only receipts. Director Harris's final words still hung in the air when Jasmine leaned forward, seizing the silence. The folder on the desk was already damning, but she wasn't finished. She had waited for this exact moment, and she struck with precision. Her tone was calm, but her pace ruthless. "Ms. Trump, did you contact federal officials regarding the Virginia Beach project?" Ivanka blinked, lips parting. No answer. Jasmine pressed again, a sharper yes or no. "Did you instruct housing and urban development staff to expedite approvals?" The chamber buzzed. Reporters leaned closer, fingers flying across keyboards. Senator Warren whispered to Booker, she's pinning her down. Ivanka exhaled, shifting in her seat. Beads of sweat glistened at her temple. She dabbed with a tissue, but it didn't stop the cameras from capturing every tremor. Jasmine's questions came like hammer strikes. Were taxpayer funds redirected into developments linked to the Trump Organization? Did you benefit personally, directly, or indirectly from these transactions? How do you explain your signature on DOJ-verified correspondence? Each time, silence. Each time, Ivanka's eyes darted to the host, to the audience, to the floor. Anywhere but Jasmine. The audience grew restless. A veteran in uniform shouted, "Answer her!" A woman in the gallery cried out, "That's our money!" Security tried to quiet the noise, but it only amplified the pressure. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his voice caught by a nearby microphone. "Every unanswered question sounds like an admission." Jasmine didn't relent. She stacked the weight higher with every word. "You preach about leadership. Tell us, is leadership lying to the American people? You claim legacy. Tell us, is legacy stealing from working families? You call it a service. Tell us, who exactly did you serve?" The host's hands trembled over his cards, helpless to intervene. The control room buzzed with frantic chatter, but no one dared cut the feed this time. The eyes of the nation were fixed on one screen, waiting for Ivanka to break. She shifted again, swallowing hard, lips trembling, as if words were caught in her throat. Her polished facade was gone. Her silence screamed louder than any defense. Jasmine leaned back at last, folding her hands. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. The questions hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. The audience roared, some chanting her name, others pounding their fists against the railing. The moment was undeniable. Ivanka Trump, once untouchable, sat cornered and mute under the glare of truth. And Jasmine Crockett had turned silence into the most damning testimony of all. The questions still lingered like echoes of gunfire, unanswered and undeniable. Jasmine had struck, and Ivanka had sat mute, sweating beneath the lights. Now the room itself seemed to shift, tilting firmly toward Jasmine. The audience erupted not in scattered bursts but in unison. A wave of clapping rose from the back rows and swept forward. Some shouted her name. Others stamped their feet against the floor until the chamber shook. The host's pleas for order vanished under the roar. Senator Gillibrand leaned toward a colleague, whispering, "She's got them. This room is hers now." Even hardened figures like Judge Whitmore gave a slow nod, his eyes fixed on Jasmine with something closer to respect than neutrality. Jasmine didn't raise her hands, didn't bask in the cheers. She sat forward, still and deliberate, letting the weight of the moment settle on Ivanka's silence. Then, with her voice steady and sharp, she pressed the point home. The American people see what just happened. When given the chance to speak truth, Ms. Trump chose silence. When asked about money stolen from families, she looked away. That is not leadership. That is abandonment. Gasps broke into louder cries of agreement. A veteran shouted, "That's right." A mother with her child in her arms called out, "We deserve better." Cameras captured every second. Networks cut to live analysis. Commentators struggling to describe the eruption of energy. On Twitter, Jasmine winds surged alongside Trump's silence. Ivanka sat rigid, her eyes locked on the desk, lips pressed tight. Every second she remained wordless only deepened the contrast. Jasmine stood as the fighter for the people, Ivanka the symbol of privilege cornered by truth. For the first time, the audience was no longer watching a duel. They were part of it, their voices adding to the pressure, their presence making Jasmine's stance even stronger. And in that chamber under the blinding lights, Ivanka Trump learned the cost of silence. The chamber still pulsed with the echoes of applause when Jasmine reached into her jacket pocket. The room hushed again instinctively, sensing something heavier was coming. She pulled out a small silver USB stick, holding it between her fingers like a blade. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in. The faint click of the plastic against the desk echoed louder than it should have. Her voice was steady, deliberate. Up until now, we've heard silence, but the American people deserve more than silence. They deserve the truth. She set the USB in front of her, sliding it across the table. Contained here are emails verified by independent forensic analysts that link Ms. Trump directly to efforts to disguise the source of funds connected to international contracts. Not speculation, not rumors. Her words, her instructions. Gasps rippled across the chamber. A reporter from the Washington Post nearly dropped his pen. Senator Warren whispered sharply to Senator Booker, "If this is real, it's over." Jasmine continued, her tone cutting through the weight of the room. These emails show Ms. Trump instructing subordinates to reroute money through shell accounts. They detail strategies to obscure ties between federal housing funds and overseas contractors in Qatar and the Cayman Islands. In plain English, this wasn't just misuse of federal money, it was laundering. The audience erupted, voices colliding, shock, outrage, disbelief. The host sat frozen, his cue cards limp in his hands. Judge Whitmore broke the silence, muttering to a nearby journalist, "That crosses into criminal conspiracy." Jasmine didn't stop. She opened a folder, pulling out printed excerpts. The words were sharp, unmistakable. Lines from Ivanka herself ensure the source line is removed before filing. Keep the origin quiet. Use private channels. Each sentence hit like a thunderclap. The audience gasped louder with every page. Ivanka's face drained of color. Sweat glistened across her forehead. She reached for her microphone, stammering, This is fabricated," but the roar of the crowd drowned her out. On Twitter, hashtags exploded in real time. Ivanka emails, the USB Trump laundering. Millions were watching the feed. Millions more sharing the clip, dissecting every word. Jasmine closed the folder and leaned back, her eyes fixed firmly on Ivanka. Her final words cut through the noise. You can deny me, you can attack me, but you cannot deny your own emails. This isn't about me. This is about the American people's money stolen and hidden under your watch. The studio boiled. Protesters outside chanted louder their voices, carrying into the chamber through the heavy glass windows. The duel was no longer a matter of pride. It was now a matter of survival. For Ivanka, every second that passed pushed her deeper into the quicksand. For Jasmine, every second turned the ground beneath her into a stage of history. And in that moment, with a USB stick no bigger than a thumb drive, Jasmine Crockett had unleashed the evidence that could bring down an empire. The silver USB, small and almost fragile in Jasmine's hand, was slotted into the committee's console. The lights dimmed slightly as the big screen behind the stage flickered awake. Every pair of eyes in the chamber locked forward. Reporters stopped typing. Even the restless murmurs died. A single email appeared, white text against a black background. The header clear from Ivanka Trump to Federal Housing Liaison. The line was short but lethal. Ensure the source line is removed before filing. Private channels only. This must not connect back. The silence was unbearable. No commentary could soften the blow. No spin could dilute the meaning. The audience gasped as the second email rolled across the screen. Keep the origin quiet. Funds are to be routed through Cayman affiliates before final reporting. A wave of shock swept through the room. Senator Gillibrand pressed her hand to her chest. Director Harris leaned forward, whispering to a colleague, "That's intent." Plain as day. The screen flashed again. This time a PDF attachment and invoice trail showing millions redirected from federal housing programs into accounts overseas. Names of shell companies transferred date signatures. Each frame tightened the noose. Cameras zoomed in on Ivanka. Her face flushed red, then drained pale. She reached for her microphone, fumbling, her voice breaking. These are taken out of context. They don't prove, but the screen didn't wait. More messages surfaced. Delete original records. Forward sanitized copy only. Approval needed within 48 hours. My father is watching. The chamber erupted. Gasps, boos, shouts filled the air. The host banged the desk, desperate for control, but he was drowned out by chaos. Jasmine sat still, her gaze locked on Ivanka. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. The evidence spoke louder than any cross-examination. Ivanka's composure crumbled. Her breathing grew shallow, her hand trembling as she wiped sweat from her brow. The cameras captured every falter. Millions at home watched as the carefully built image of Grace collapsed in real time. And then, under the merciless glare of the lights, Ivanka faltered completely. Her body slumped forward, head dipping. The audience gasped as aides rushed to her side. A paramedic team stationed for emergencies scrambled into the chamber. For a moment, the chaos reached a fever pitch. Some shouted in disbelief. Others filmed with shaking hands. CNN cut live to the scene. Ivanka Trump collapses during hearing. Judge Whitmore muttered under his breath, "This isn't just politics anymore. This is history breaking in front of us." Outside crowds surged, chanting Jasmine's name. On social media, the clip spread faster than anything before. Hashtags stormed the global feeds. Ivanka collapse, the emails, truth on screen. Back inside, Jasmine remained seated, her eyes steady, her hands folded. She hadn't moved since the screen lit up. Her silence had become her signature, a blade sharper than words. When the screen finally faded to black, the room was transformed. No one doubted what they had just seen. The dynasty that once felt untouchable now looked fragile, broken, and exposed for all to witness. And as Ivanka was escorted out under the weight of flashing cameras, one fact was undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had not just won a battle. She had altered the course of American memory. The screen had gone black, but the nation was still reeling from the images burned into their eyes. Ivanka being carried out by aides. Jasmine unmoved, a calm silhouette at the center of chaos, and the emails, undeniable damning, scrolling in front of millions. Within minutes, every network scrambled to frame the moment. CNN's banner screamed 14 seconds that shook America. MSNBC ran with the collapse of a dynasty live on air. Fox, struggling to contain the storm, muttered cautiously about an aggressive ambush, but their words were drowned by the tidal wave everywhere else. The numbers spread like wildfire. 14 seconds. The precise time from Jasmine holding up the USB to the first email appearing on the screen. In that span, the dynasty that had weathered scandals, lawsuits, and impeachments crumbled live on television. Reporters outside the chamber shouted over one another. NBC's Andrea Mitchell, her voice cracking with disbelief, told the cameras, "I've covered Washington for decades. Never have I seen power collapse so fast." In homes across America, people replayed the clip again and again. On Twitter, hashtags surged 14 seconds, Trump empire falls, Jasmine wins. Memes flooded TikTok, stitching Jasmine's still frame against the flashing words from Ivanka's own emails. Even inside the government, reactions split. Senator Warren called it accountability at last. Senator Collins, whose name appeared in the earlier threads, slipped quietly out a side exit, chased by reporters demanding answers. Judge Whitmore, caught by microphones as he left, simply muttered, "This will be taught in law schools." Jasmine remained inside the chamber, composed. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply let the weight of silence do the work. For her, the evidence was enough. For Ivanka, the silence had become her verdict. The public wasn't waiting for a trial. They had seen enough. Commentators across the spectrum declared the moment a breaking point. The Atlantic wrote, "It wasn't the hearings, the lawsuits, or the speeches that fractured the Trump brand. It was 14 seconds of truth." Ivanka's collapse became symbolic, a dynasty undone not by an army of prosecutors, but by one congresswoman wielding a USB and a question. And so the story took root, the headline already etched into history, 14 seconds to bring down the Trump empire. The phrase had already taken root, 14 seconds to bring down the Trump empire. Every headline, every broadcast, every late-night monologue repeated it like scripture. But the country was far from united in how it felt about what had just unfolded. In cities across the East Coast, people poured into bars and living rooms, replaying the clip of Jasmine holding up the USB. Cheers erupted every time the incriminating words flashed across the screen. In Philadelphia, crowds gathered outside Independence Hall, waving homemade signs, "Crockett versus Truth." In Chicago, veterans stood with union workers chanting her name. For them, Jasmine had done what no prosecutor, no judge, no journalist had managed in years: cut through the fog and expose the dynasty. Commentators like Rachel Maddow declared it the clearest act of political courage in a generation. Senator Elizabeth Warren posted that Jasmine had given voice to every American who ever felt powerless against privilege. Hashtags swelled Jasmine Hero Truth in 14 sec. But elsewhere, the backlash was just as fierce. On conservative talk radio, Mark Levin thundered that Jasmine was a disgrace to Congress, weaponizing humiliation for cheap applause. Tucker Carlson called her performance a theatrical ambush, warning that America was crossing into mob politics. Fox News Kyron blared, "Excessive Crockett crosses the line." In Texas and Florida, rallies formed with signs reading, "Stand with Ivanka and stop the witch hunt." Senator Ted Cruz went live on Fox, arguing that Jasmine's silence then strike strategy was not justice but cruelty. The division cut deep even among independents. Editorial boards debated whether exposing Trump family scandals belonged in a congressional forum. The Wall Street Journal wrote cautiously, "Evidence matters, but style also matters. Crockett may have weakened her case by weaponizing embarrassment." Inside the Capitol, the split was equally raw. Judge Whitmore admitted on record, "The evidence is unshakable, but the method that will haunt this chamber." Director Harris, who had presented the GAO findings, told NPR bluntly, "Truth is rarely polite. It is rarely gentle. But it was necessary. For Jasmine, none of it seemed to matter. She didn't answer the praise nor the condemnation. She stayed silent, her image replayed again and again, her stillness beside Ivanka's collapse. Her quiet eyes as the emails blazed on the screen. The nation was left to wrestle with the question, was this the moment America finally saw accountability, or had it witnessed a spectacle too sharp, too cruel to heal from? One fact was undeniable. Whether seen as savior or aggressor, Jasmine Crockett had seized the country's full attention. And with the empire cracking, the divide was no longer about one family. It was about what kind of America people wanted to live in. The nation's split was mirrored inside the Capitol itself. What had begun as a clash between Jasmine and Ivanka now widened into a congressional battlefield. Senator Lindsey Graham was the first to step forward, his voice booming across the chamber. He accused Jasmine of crossing every line of propriety, calling her display a public execution masquerading as oversight. His face reddened as he warned that hearings were never meant to humiliate families, and that Jasmine had turned the sacred chamber into a theater of cruelty. The words stoked the fire. Gasps and jeers rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras swiveling to catch every angle. But before Graham could press further, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose from her seat, her voice sharp and precise. She fired back that what Graham called cruelty was actually accountability, and that the true disgrace was not Jasmine's question, but Ivanka's silence. The exchange escalated. Graham thundered about respect for institutions, about decorum and tradition. Ocasio-Cortez shot back with facts, citing the GAO report, quoting the very emails Jasmine had placed on the record. "If evidence makes you uncomfortable," she said then, "the problem is not the evidence. The problem is the conduct." The chamber shook with noise. Some lawmakers pounded their desks in support of Graham, shouting about political hit jobs. Others rallied behind Ocasio-Cortez, chanting "Truth matters." Judge Whitmore intervened, trying to calm the room, but his voice was drowned in the uproar. Director Harris sat stone-faced, watching as his report became the spark for open warfare between factions of government. Jasmine did not rise. She remained still, her hands folded, her eyes on Ivanka, who sat pale and unmoving, the shadow of collapse still hanging over her. Jasmine's silence was louder than any shout. On social media, the clash inside the chamber fueled the storm outside. Clips of Graham's speech went viral among conservative audiences, hailed as defense of dignity. At the same time, Ocasio-Cortez's fiery rebuttal trended worldwide under Accountability Now, with millions replaying her line about conduct over comfort. The divide deepened. Protests outside the Capitol swelled as counter-protests formed across the street. Chants collided. "Jasmine is our voice against Stop the Witch Hunt." Police barriers strained under the weight of crowds who refused to leave. Inside, the arguments grew sharper, harsher. Lawmakers who had once stayed neutral now felt compelled to choose sides. Senators whispered alliances, representatives shouted across the aisle. The hearing had ceased to be about a single USB, a single scandal. It had become a referendum on power itself. In that moment, one truth was undeniable. Jasmine had not just cornered Ivanka. She had pulled the entire Congress into the fire. And the chamber, like the nation, was now split down the middle, every word a spark, every silence an accelerant. The shouting inside the Capitol had not yet faded when the first foreign news tickers lit up. What America saw as chaos, the world now consumed as a spectacle of reckoning. In London, the BBC cut into regular programming with a banner, "Congresswoman Strike Stuns Trump Legacy." The segment replayed the clip of Jasmine holding up the USB and Ivanka crumbling under the glare of the big screen. British anchors marveled at the speed. 14 seconds, and an empire cracked. Across Europe, the headlines turned sharper. Le Monde in Paris declared the silence of Ivanka, the voice of Jasmine. Germany's Der Spiegel called it a dynasty shaken. In Italy, newspapers splashed Jasmine's image across their front pages, her still gaze compared to a hammer that falls without noise. In Asia, the story dominated screens. NHK in Japan described it as the most dramatic hearing of the decade. In South Korea, commentators linked Jasmine's relentless questioning to their own political corruption trials. In India, the Times ran the headline, "One Question One, USB One Collapse." Even Al Jazeera broadcast the moment on repeat, framing it as evidence of America's internal fractures, but also a glimpse of accountability rarely seen on global television. By dawn, Jasmine Crockett's face had become universal. Her image, seated calm, her eyes fixed forward as Ivanka faltered, was plastered across international covers. Social media turned her into a global icon, hashtags in multiple languages, spreading Jasmine Crockett, 14 seconds truth in America. But the reaction wasn't uniform. Russian state TV mocked the scene, calling it another circus of American politics. Chinese outlets used it to argue that Western democracy thrived on public humiliation. Yet even in their derision, they amplified the image, pushing Jasmine into homes and headlines worldwide. Inside the U.S., the weight of global coverage fueled the fire. Supporters flooded the streets emboldened by the knowledge that the world was watching. Protesters held signs not only in Washington and New York, but in Paris, Berlin, and Sydney solidarity marches forming overnight. Back in the Capitol, lawmakers couldn't ignore the glare of foreign eyes. Senator Graham fumed privately that America was being humiliated on the world stage. Representative Ocasio-Cortez countered that this was precisely the moment to show that no dynasty is above scrutiny. Judge Whitmore, interviewed by the BBC, admitted, "We've crossed into history." The entire globe just witnessed accountability unravel in real time. And so Jasmine's image, no longer just an American story, became a mirror held up to the world. To some, she was a symbol of courage. To others, she was proof of America's decline into spectacle. But none could look away. The silence she once wielded in the chamber had now expanded across continents. Her stillness, her unflinching eyes had spoken louder than any speech. The world knew her name, and the empire she had confronted would never be seen the same way again. The chamber had become a stage of history. The images of Ivanka slumping under the lights, the emails on the screen, the eruption of global headlines, all of it now hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Cameras were still rolling, every lens fixed on one figure, Jasmine Crockett. She waited. She always knew the power of silence. The audience hushed, sensing what was about to come. Senators shifted in their seats. Reporters raised pens, knowing they were about to capture lines that would live beyond the night. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice calm but firm, each syllable carrying the weight of everything that had unfolded. America is not the property of one family name. It is not a crown to be passed from parent to child, nor a dynasty to be inherited like real estate. America belongs to every worker who built its bridges, every soldier who defended its soil, every parent who sacrificed for their child's tomorrow. That is the truth we cannot forget. The chamber stirred. The words were not shouted, but they cut sharper than any accusation. She lifted the folder of emails once more, tapping it lightly. What we saw tonight was not just corruption. It was the arrogance of believing that privilege is stronger than people, that a last name is a shield, that silence can erase guilt. But the American people deserve more than silence. They deserve justice. They deserve respect. Murmurs of agreement swelled from the gallery. Judge Whitmore closed his eyes as if marking the weight of the moment. Jasmine pressed on. I was not born into dynasties. I was not raised in towers. My roots are in the neighborhoods where rent goes unpaid, where veterans wait for care, where mothers stretch every dollar to survive. Those Americans are told every day that they do not belong at the table. Tonight I sat here for them. Tonight I spoke so that their silence would not be mistaken for consent. The audience erupted in applause, but Jasmine raised her hands, slightly steadying them back into quiet. Her tone deepened. And to those who say this was excessive, let me be clear. Excessive is a family draining money from the people while preaching about service. Excessive is rewriting the law for profit. Excessive is demanding loyalty to a name instead of a flag. What I did tonight was not cruelty, it was clarity. Gasps rang out, but this time they were followed by cheers. Reporters typed furiously, knowing the phrases would dominate headlines by dawn. Jasmine paused, letting the echoes fade. Then she delivered her final blow. This country does not belong to the Trumps. It does not belong to the Crockett family either. It belongs to the teachers, the nurses, the janitors, the farmers, the soldiers, the children yet unborn. No last name, no dynasty, no empire will ever change that truth. And if anyone dares to forget it, let this night remind them. The chamber exploded. Applause thundered. Some senators rose to their feet. Protesters outside, hearing the words through live broadcasts, lifted their voices in chants that shook the streets. This is our America. Cameras zoomed in on Jasmine's face. Calm, composed, but fierce. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply let the sound of the crowd wash over her, a storm of affirmation. International feeds cut her words into subtitles, broadcasting across continents. The BBC labeled it a closing statement for the ages. CNN's Kyron declared Crockett America belongs to the people. Even skeptical outlets admitted that Jasmine had seized the night not through spectacle, but through conviction. Ivanka was gone from the chamber, escorted out long before Jasmine spoke. But her absence only magnified the contrast. One woman vanished under pressure. The other stood steady and rewrote the narrative of the nation. When Jasmine finally leaned back, her hands folding in front of her, the chamber erupted again. Reporters shouted questions, but none were answered. The words she had spoken were enough. And as the lights dimmed and the hearing edged to its end, one fact was already certain: Jasmine Crockett's closing remarks would echo in classrooms and living rooms and in history books. Because in those final minutes, she had not only dismantled an empire, she had reminded America of who it truly belonged to. The chamber had erupted with Jasmine's words, but the true echo began far beyond those marble walls. Across the country in neighborhoods often ignored, the reaction was not abstract, it was visceral. In Atlanta's West End, a group of veterans gathered at a community center, the television still glowing from the replay. Among them was Sergeant James Holloway, who had served 2 tours in Iraq. His voice trembled as he said to reporters, "She spoke for us. We fought for this country, but too often we're treated like scraps, while the powerful live untouched." Tonight she reminded them that America is ours too. His words spread quickly online, picked up by MSNBC and then CNN. In Detroit, auto workers leaving their night shift stopped to watch highlights on a cracked screen outside a bar. A woman in grease-stained coveralls told a local news crew, "I don't care about dynasties. I care about my paycheck, my kids' school, and whether anyone in Washington even knows we exist." Crockett made me believe someone does. The clip went viral, cutting against polished talking heads with its raw truth. Churches in Baltimore held impromptu gatherings where Jasmine's final remarks were replayed on projectors. Pastor Raymond Ellis told his congregation, "This was not about one woman against another. This was about whether truth can still breathe in America." And for once it did. Congregants wept, clapped, and began to chant Jasmine's name as though it were a hymn. At the same time, veterans groups across the Midwest issued joint statements praising her courage. The American Legion Post in St. Louis wrote, "For every veteran who has wondered if their sacrifice meant anything, Jasmine Crockett reminded us that our fight was for the people, not for dynasties." Workers' unions seized the moment. The AFL-CIO circulated her speech across its chapters, urging members to see it as a turning point. Labor leaders pointed to her insistence that America belongs to workers, not to corporate empires. At a rally in Pittsburgh, miners' helmets and nurses' scrubs stood side by side chanting, "This is our America." But the voices that resonated most came from the African American community, who understood the sting of being told explicitly or implicitly to go somewhere else. In Houston, a mother named Denise Carter, whose son had been expelled from school after racial taunts, spoke to CBS News with tears in her eyes. When Ivanka told Jasmine to go to Africa, she told all of us we don't belong here. Jasmine's answer that this land is ours too gave my son back his pride. The New York Times profiled Denise the next day, her words cutting through the noise of pundits and politicians. The story spread globally, showing the human side of what had unfolded in Washington. Even within the political elite, voices broke through the gridlock. Senator Cory Booker told the Senate floor, "Jasmine's courage is now part of the American record. Every child who feels excluded saw themselves included last night." Meanwhile, conservative critics doubled down, accusing her of turning the chamber into a stage. But each attempt to smear her seemed to be met with a flood of testimonies from ordinary people who refused to let her be diminished. CNN ran a segment featuring 3 Americans, a black veteran from Georgia, a Latina nurse from Arizona, and a white factory worker from Ohio. Each shared how Jasmine's words made them feel less invisible. The segment ended with the anchor saying, "In a divided nation, this may be the rare moment where the unheard finally found a voice." Social media amplified these personal stories. Hashtags like "Voices for Jasmine" and "We Belong Here" trended for days. Memes of her calm face beside Ivanka's collapse were stitched with quotes from veterans, workers, and mothers. The image of Jasmine standing firm, speaking without flinch, was no longer just a moment of political theater. It had become a symbol of belonging, a declaration that the nation's promises did not belong to clans or dynasties, but to the people themselves. And as night fell, the question that haunted America was not whether Jasmine had gone too far. It was whether the nation was ready to live up to the truth she had dared to speak. The wave of testimonies from workers, veterans, and mothers had filled the air like a chorus. Yet Jasmine knew that what mattered now was not only exposing corruption, but anchoring a truth larger than one scandal. The hearing chamber was nearly empty, cameras still humming when Jasmine stood for what would be her final word to the committee and to the nation. She didn't lift papers this time. She didn't gesture toward screens. She simply steadied herself, her voice low, deliberate. Respect does not come from a last name. Respect comes from bravery, from facing what others fear to say, from standing when it would be easier to bow. That is the measure of a citizen. The line fell heavy. Even the most hardened reporters leaned in, scribbling, as if afraid to lose a syllable. Jasmine looked around the chamber, her eyes pausing on the empty chair Ivanka had left behind. Every American deserves to be heard, not just the ones born into towers, not just the ones who inherit wealth. Every single voice, the veteran on dialysis, the mother juggling two jobs, the child who feels invisible in class, they all matter. It wasn't a flourish. It was plain stripped of ornament, and that made it sting harder. International media caught the clip within minutes. Al Jazeera labeled it, "Crockett respect is earned, not inherited." BBC pushed it to their front-page subtitles trailing across European screens. In South Africa, radio hosts replayed the words, drawing parallels with their own battles against privilege. But inside America, the message pierced deepest. CNN's Kyron read, "Crockett bravery, not family, defines us." MSNBC called it the line that could define a generation. Even conservative outlets, though critical, couldn't ignore the phrasing. Fox commentators grimaced as they admitted the rhetoric would land in classrooms and courtrooms for years. The impact spread beyond headlines. In Philadelphia, high school students painted the words on banners hung across gymnasiums. In Atlanta, veterans held vigils with candles, repeating the line as if it were scripture. On TikTok, young activists spliced her quote with images of protests and marches, the phrase "respect through bravery," trending in hours. The establishment bristled. Senator Graham snapped that she was romanticizing rebellion, yet even he could not erase the resonance. Representative Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what democracy sounds like." Senator Cory Booker echoed, "This is what courage looks like." Judge Whitmore, asked by the Washington Post if he agreed with Jasmine's declaration, gave a rare public statement. History has always been written by those who dared to speak when silence was safer. Her words belong to that history now. For Ivanka, silence was no longer a tactic but a burden. Each headline carried her collapse beside Jasmine's declaration, a contrast etched into the nation's memory. The dynasty's heir had been undone not just by documents, but by a sentence that stripped privilege of its shield. On the streets, the divide remained fierce. Some carried signs reading, "She went too far." But across parks, city halls, and town squares, another chant grew louder. Bravery earns respect. It was no longer about the USB or the emails, or even Ivanka herself. It was about something elemental: who counted in America and who did not. Jasmine had answered that question in a way that pierced across lines of race, class, and geography. And as she stepped down from the platform that night, one thing became clear. What began as a confrontation had grown into something else, a creed repeated from Harlem to Houston, from veterans' halls to schoolyards. Respect was no longer chained to dynasties. It had been reclaimed by bravery. And in that reclamation, Jasmine Crockett had not only dismantled an empire, she had offered America a new measure of itself. Jasmine's journey shows us a truth bigger than politics. Dignity is not gifted by wealth or family names. It is claimed through courage, honesty, and the refusal to be silenced. She asked the question no one dared, and the world listened. Each of us has moments where fear tempts us to stay quiet. Now it's your turn. When respect is denied, will you stay silent, or will you demand to be heard? This video is created for educational and inspirational purposes, under fair use, not to defame or attack any individual. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. It means the world. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share so more voices can join this journey. Until next time, stay strong, stay awake, and I'll see you in the next video.